Hello. The Glocal is a podcast brought to you by Kwansei Gakuin University, Tokyo Marunouchi campus.
こんにちは。Welcome to the Glocal Podcast.
We are your hosts, Kangaku Taro and Tamago.
We are both full of curiosity and motivated to learn about the world.
In each episode, we will contact people all over the world and talk about their countries. We will discuss everything from arts and culture to sports and current events. But unlike the news on TV, we will talk to regular people like you and me. We think there's a lot to learn from people we don't normally see on TV. We plan to release episodes every 2 weeks. We hope you enjoy them. If you want us to cover a particular country or topic, please contact us and let us know.
Hi, Colin. How are you?
I'm very well. Good morning, Taro.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Hello, Colin. Thank you for joining us.
It's nice to meet you, Tamago. Thank you for having me.
So, Colin-san, we heard that you came to Japan by boat from Russia.
You heard correctly. That's true. I did.
Okay, so it sounds crazy. So we wanted to talk to you and get all the details, if you don't mind.
Yeah, fire away. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. So first question is, why did you do it?
My children, my sons live in Tokyo with my ex-wife. And so we're supposed to spend the summers together and holidays together. But this year with the coronavirus, we weren't able to spend these regular holidays together. And I could see that was affecting our relationship. And so I was trying to find some way to get out to see them that would still allow us to spend time together and have a good time together.
Okay. And so how did you decide that this was the best way to come to Japan?
There's a famous exchange between Sherlock Holmes and Watson. And so Sherlock Holmes says to Watson, so Sherlock Holmes is this British detective who investigates these strange cases. And so famously he says to Watson is his sidekick, the person who helps him. Watson's a doctor. And so Holmes says to Watson at some point that when you've eliminated all of the other possibilities, the only one that remains, no matter how strange, has to be the right one.
Wow.
So I had eliminated all of the other possibilities. So to start, when I began wondering about how to get back to Japan, I looked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' COVID entry guidance website. And that had a long list of countries that we now call the entry denial countries. And if you'd been in any of those countries in the previous 14 days, you wouldn't be allowed into Japan. So it was a long list, but it wasn't a complete list of countries. So first, what I tried to do is I tried to see if there were any countries that weren't on that list that still had direct flights to Japan.
That were not on that list.
Correct, that's right. So I wanted to know whether it was really every country that you could get to Japan from, or whether there were still some countries that you could fly from to Japan that weren't on that list. And so I went to the websites of Narita and Haneda, and I looked at all of the airplanes that were landing, and I checked the airplanes that were landing against the entry denial list, and all of the countries that were flying into Narita and Haneda were on the entry denial list. So that ruled out. It turns out I was wrong. I only checked the Narita and Haneda list on a couple of occasions, so I missed some flights. There was a flight from Sri Lanka, for example. At one point, Sri Lanka wasn't yet on the entry denial list, and there were flights from Sri Lanka. So I missed those flights. I didn't learn that until this month, actually.
So if you had not missed it, you would have gone to Sri Lanka instead.
Well, so this got me kind of alarmed because I thought, had I done this whole crazy trip unnecessarily? But it turns out, okay, so the other part of the trick is, could I get to Sri Lanka in the first place? And no, Sri Lanka had a complete entry denial, so even more extensive than Japan's. So I'd given up at that point on flying in the usual way. So the next thing I did was try and understand whether I could get in under what are called exceptional circumstances. And the argument was that my children are here in Japan. I'm not a citizen. I'm not a resident. But I have children, I have family in Japan, and it's difficult for us to maintain this long distance relationship. And the standard criteria for an exceptional circumstances application is that you need medical treatment, or someone is dying, or someone has in fact already died, and there's a funeral taking place. And I didn't qualify for any of those categories.
So family reunification is not one of those.
It was not. The question. Okay, so this is still earlier in the summer. I think probably the way in which this has been interpreted has changed over the course of the year. But early in the summer, those were not the examples that were being used, and so I had a very clear statement from the Japanese embassy in London that those conditions would not be sufficient for an exceptional circumstances application. It may have made a difference if my children were Japanese. In fact, there's another woman who has been able to successfully return. She's divorced. Her daughter has Japanese citizenship as well. So I for a while, I was wondering where the idea of sailing in came from. And it turns out, I think it comes from another friend of mine called Jules. So somehow I had this idea of traveling by sea. And it turns out I was writing with Jules a couple of days ago. And she said, yeah, she gave me that idea.
Wow.
And so when I look at my diary and I look at my notes, the time I start looking for a ship is after Jules had sent me that WhatsApp message. And so the idea there was that the entry ban requirements says that if you've been in any of these countries in the previous 14 days, then you can't come into Japan. And so the idea of traveling in by sea was then pretty straightforward. If I could spend 14 days at sea after having left whatever country, then I could satisfy that condition. Now, there were a couple of other twists. One of them I've mentioned already. Could I get to a country in the first place to start the trip? The second one, though, is Japan isn't issuing tourist visas at this point. So when I did arrive in Japan, I would satisfy the entry ban condition, but how would I get in as a tourist? So it turns out there are a couple of countries that still have what's called a visa waiver program in place. So Japan has so visa waiver program is what allows you to visit another country without getting a visa in advance. You just fly in, you're in the airport, you go through customs, you give them your passport, they stamp your passport. That's because there's a visa waiver program. A waiver means that you don't need something. It's been disregarded.
Right.
So in most advanced countries have visa waiver programs with most other advanced countries. But Japan suspended its visa waiver program with most of its partner countries as part of its COVID entry restrictions. But they kept them in place for at least two countries, including the United States and Canada. So I'm a Canadian citizen. And so this would allow me, I thought, to get into Japan if I could spend 14 days at sea. But then the next question was, would that be respected? Suppose I showed up at a port in Japan and thought that I was being very smart and thought that I'd found this way of complying with Japanese law. Would I just be told, gomenasai, and be put back on the sailboat? So to understand that, I worked with someone called a yacht agent. So yacht agents' jobs are to help their clients who are sailing between countries, sailing internationally. So they help their clients arrive in the country that they're expert in, and then travel around that country. So they'll help their clients with the paperwork to get into a country. So I worked with an extremely good yacht agent called Kirk Patterson, who used to be the dean of Temple University in Tokyo. Wow. And then after he retired as dean, he returned to Canada. He taught himself how to sail. He sailed by himself across the Pacific. He got to Hawaii a bit late, and so if he'd continued on from Hawaii, he would have been caught in typhoon season, which he didn't want to be. And so he spent the winter in Hawaii, and he found himself wondering what to do. So he took a bartending course, and as a result, this former university dean was bartending in Hawaii.
Nice.
And then continued the next spring on to onto Japan. That's right. And then has since become a yacht agent. So he lives down in Fukuoka now, and so he was able to speak to the authorities in Fukuoka, and they assured him that if I hadn't been in any other country for 14 days as a Canadian, I could enter Japan without a problem.
Excellent. So now the question remains where to sail from.
Exactly. Yes, you're keeping track of this. Very good. Yeah. So and that was not a trivial question either, because most of the other countries in East Asia have adopted similarly restrictive entry requirements to Japan, and in fact even more. So I started keeping a list of all countries in the region, and I was checking websites on a weekly basis just to see if I could get into any of those countries. And at first, it was no for everyone except for the United States, because the United States has these small island holdings in the Pacific. And so the most promising one at the time was Guam. And so I could fly to Guam. I would have had to have flown expensively. I would have flown from the UK to the US, from the US to Hawaii, and then from Hawaii on to Guam. That would have been an expensive flight to begin with. But when I reached Guam, my quarantine period there could have been as short as required for me to start sailing. So I wouldn't have had to spend 14 days quarantining if I had a sailboat or a boat leaving 2 days later. So I could have made that transition reasonably seamlessly. So I wrote to every dive company I could find in Guam. I wrote to the harbor master at the port in Guam. I was trying to get in touch with the Japanese Guam Association. So I was on Facebook buy and sell groups saying I was trying to buy a trip from Guam to Japan. So every possible way of getting in touch with people in Guam I was trying out, because I was sure that there would be vessels in Guam that were sailing to Japan.
Sure.
Now, the obvious way of doing it would have been to do it with a commercial vessel that was already sailing. So even though passenger travel has fallen apart with COVID, there still is shipping taking place. So when I was looking into shipping, there were two problems. First, the shipping companies have stopped taking passengers, even if they ever. So shipping companies take a small number of passengers in the first place. But then with COVID, they've stopped doing that, and this makes perfect sense as well. If you remember the first cases in Japan, they were clustered on these cruise liners. So cruise liners are different than cargo vessels, but that's still a group of people aboard a boat. The second problem is that even from Guam, a cargo ship takes 7 or 8 days to reach Japan, so it wouldn't take long enough for me to satisfy the 14-day condition. So if I was going to do it, I was going to need, I thought, to do it on a private vessel. And so this is why I was writing the dive companies. And so eventually I did find a charter company that they usually do deep sea fishing. And they gave me exactly the response that I wanted to hear. They said, like, they've done the trip before. It's going to be intense. And like, I liked the sound of that. I thought, like, this, being in this intense trip on the high seas. But the price estimate they came up with was far too expensive. It would have been about $70,000 US.
Of course.
Yeah.
You can probably buy a boat and sail it yourself for that amount.
Yeah, so that was Kirk's. So when I spoke to Kirk, my yacht agent, afterwards about that, Kirk said that's about the price of buying it and sinking it for them. And but anyhow, that was the price. I didn't feel myself to be in a position to negotiate. And so at that point, I'd kind of given up. However, this is where the Russians came to the rescue. So it turns out Russia had begun to open up to tourists. And the list that I saw in July opened them up to tourists from 3 countries: Tanzania, Turkey, and the United Kingdom.
Wow.
And so I looked at this list and I thought, like, how on earth does this list make any sense whatsoever? I thought maybe alphabetical order. And then I thought it doesn't matter if it makes sense or not. All that matters is that I might be able to get there. So I'm not a British citizen, but I do have residence in the UK. So I'm a Canadian citizen with residence in the UK. And it turns out the openness to the UK included residents of the UK. So as a British resident, I should be able to get into Russia. As a Canadian citizen, I should then be able to get into Japan. So it was this bizarre set of coincidences.
Nice.
So the next step then was to try and find a vessel that would take me from Russia, from Vladivostok, which is the main Pacific port, to Japan.
Vladivostok is on the far eastern side of Russia, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's the main far eastern port in Russia. So it's the terminus of the it may not be the exact terminus of the Trans-Siberian Railway, but it's Russia's Pacific port. Now, the Russo-Japanese War was in part about Russian Pacific ports, but at that point, Russia had a treaty port in China, a port called Port Arthur. And that was the one that Russia was really interested in because that was open year round, whereas Vladivostok gets iced in the winter. And so Vladivostok is the main Far Eastern Russian port, but it's not a Four Seasons port.
What happened to Port Arthur? Just a little aside here.
Yeah, well, so this was, it's an interesting historical aside from a Japanese perspective as well. The Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905 was won by Japan, and which was surprising and significant in its own right, but it also became significant in the larger context as well. This was seen as the first time a non-European power had defeated a European power in a major conflict. And so this fueled, I think, a dual sense in Japan. So on the one hand, a sense of Japanese nationalism, which continued through the Pacific War period. But on the other hand, a sense of Japan joining the European powers, maybe even as the way in which European powers were demonstrating their civilization was very complicated at the time. They were clearly technologically more advanced, but they were also colonizing poorer countries and oppressing poorer countries, often under the guise of bringing civilization to these poorer countries. So I think that aspect of it appealed to Japan as well, and it saw other countries in Southeast Asia that were being ruled by European powers, and so there was a desire to liberate these countries as well. So in the Japanese history, this was very significant. In Russian history, this was also very significant because it was a major defeat for the Tsar. It led to the first uprising against the Tsar's power, which wasn't sufficient at the time to topple the Tsar, but did lead a decade later to the Russian Revolution, which did. So that was an interesting. So Russia lost Port Arthur, which I think is now part of China proper.
And decades later, it led you to go to Vladivostok instead of Port Arthur.
Yes, yeah. I wonder if Port Arthur would have been even more convenient. It would have. Well, so one of the tricks then was so I had to spend 14 days at sea, and so I was getting slightly mixed messages from Kirk about what the story was that we were going to present when I arrived in Fukuoka. So my belief was that the story we were going to present was that I spent 14 days at sea because that's what I had to spend at sea in order to get into Japan. That's what I was trying to do.
Sure.
Kirk thought it would look slightly better if the journey looked more like it could have maybe been a 14-day journey in the first place. So if we'd sailed from a closer port, then that wouldn't have looked even like it could have been a 14-day journey. So for example, Hakodate is much closer to Vladivostok. You sail due east from Vladivostok and you get to Hakodate. He recommended against Hakodate for a number of reasons.
Where is Hakodate?
Hakodate is in Hokkaido. So yeah, if you sail due, so at that point, Vladivostok is not far from Japan, and if you sail due east, you could get there in a day, a day maybe two.
Right.
So, but because Japan and Russia are still officially at war, so the Soviet Union declared war on Japan at the end of in late 1945, just after the atomic bombs had been dropped. So I think the interpretation is that the Soviet Union was trying to get a slice of the pie. They wanted to make sure they were going to be part of whatever treaty negotiations took place after Japan surrendered. So they seized some Japanese territories. They seized Sakhalin. They didn't seize Hokkaido. But as a result, there still is officially the state of war between Japan and Russia. And so apparently in Hakodate, there's possibly, I'm hearing this from Kirk, there's a greater degree of suspicion about Russian vessels clearing into Hakodate. So that was one of the reasons that he thought Hakodate wouldn't be quite as good. Also, he was in Fukuoka, so he could be physically present when I arrived and could help explain things to, etc. So those are the reasons that we aimed at Fukuoka.
So you choose a Russian company. So what's the most difficult part to negotiate with the Russian companies? Or actually not the Russians?
Yeah. So in the end, it wasn't even a Russian company. I had written a Russian travel agency, and one of the people from the travel agency wrote back on a private email address. And his initial, he said he'd found a captain and a boat. Mm-hmm. And it would cost $15,000 and I had to pay it all up front. So I now have a Russian writing to me on a private email address telling me to send him $15,000. And so that was the biggest difficulty. So I was concerned about being scammed by the Russians. And it turns out, as I got to know them, what I understood is that they were concerned about being scammed by me. So my concern about Russia is a concern that arises because I was going to do business once with one group of Russians. They've been living in Russia their whole lives. They've been scammed by people their whole lives. So their big concern was that, given that I was going to be allowed to leave the sailboat in Fukuoka because I was Canadian, whereas as Russians, they weren't going to be allowed to leave the sailboat. We could get to Fukuoka and I could just jump off.
But they can't.
Correct. They couldn't chase me. So if I just disappeared at that point, then they would have had a nice trip, but that would have been it. So the deal we eventually worked out was that I would pay 30% upfront after Kirk was satisfied with their papers and with the plan. So at this point, we're looking at sailing during typhoon season. And there was a major, I think it was called the Gulf Livestock 1. There was a major vessel that sank at the beginning of September. It killed 40 people, 6,000 cattle. So this was a new, large, professionally crewed, well-equipped major vessel that sank in a typhoon. And so that's, we're on a much smaller racing boat. So Kirk's suggestion was that we wait until we had a clear week of weather forecast and that we go as quickly as we could from Vladivostok towards Fukuoka. We weren't going to be allowed to enter Japanese waters for 14 full days. So we had to stay either in international waters or in Korean waters. But the idea was that we would make as much progress as we could getting towards Fukuoka in the first week when we had a clear weather forecast. And then we'd have to take our chances with the second week if a typhoon did come up. So we would be allowed to enter Japanese waters before 14 days if there was a named storm. So a typhoon or a named tropical storm. But in the worst case, we could make our way into a Korean port as well. That might destroy that would destroy the 14-day clock that I was trying to maintain. So it might mean that I couldn't get into Japan, but it would mean at least that we wouldn't be at sea during a typhoon. Yeah, so the first payment was to be triggered after Kirk was happy with the plans, the boat registration, the passports. The second payment was to be triggered when we set sail from Vladivostok, and that was going to be 30% as well. And then the final payment Kirk would have in cash in Fukuoka, and he would hand that to the Russians before I left the ship.
So you're on the boat day one, let's say you're in Vladivostok.
Yeah.
You flew from the UK to maybe Moscow and then Vladivostok?
Yeah,
is that right?
Exactly right, yeah.
Okay.
London, Moscow, and then Moscow, Vladivostok. And the thing that surprised me was that this has been a lot of work to this point. And it's a race just leaving London. I need to buy a new phone. I need to get a COVID test within 72 hours of departure. I need to get my visa from the Russians, and there's there've been complications with that as well. So I'm just going flat out to the point that I get to Heathrow on Thursday, the 24th of September. And so I finally board and I sit down and I think, you know what? I'm just going to watch films on this flight. But the plane that we have doesn't have televisions in the back of the seat, and so I can't. I don't remember if I read or what I do, but it's kind of a low end Boeing. It's like a Boeing 737, I think, and it's a bit stripped down. It's like you'd expect a charter, like EasyJet flight to be. The next day, though, flying from Moscow to Vladivostok, it's a Boeing 777. It's a bigger plane. It's more modern. It's got screens in the backs of seats. And so I realized, like with Russia, because it's such a vast country, the international flights are the insignificant flights. It's the domestic flights that are the big flights.
So I was going to ask you, London to Moscow is how many hours?
And like Moscow, 4 hours, 3-4 hours.
Oh, that's pretty close.
That's close.
Yeah.
And then Moscow, Vladivostok is how many hours?
9-10 hours.
Incredible.
Wow.
So my crew are, 2 of them are in their mid-50s, and then Dima, the captain, is probably 46 or 47. They've lived in Russia their whole lives. One of the Alexes has worked as a ship's cook, so he spent a lot of time at sea. But none of them have ever been to Moscow. So they're Russians. One of them has been to Europe. That was Alex Maklikov. And so his company, he was an electrical engineer. His engineering company had sent him to a sister company in Tallinn in Estonia during the Soviet period. So these
which is not really.
It's not Russia. It was, it's Europe. It's Europe. It's Balkans.
During the Soviet.
Baltic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do they, I'm sorry, do they speak English or you speak Russian?
It turns out they spoke better English than I was concerned. Okay, so here's kind of an interesting backstory twist. In 1994, when I moved to the UK to start my graduate studies, I'd sailed from Montreal to Liverpool. And at this point, I didn't know how to find a vessel for sailing. And so my father and I went down to the docks in Montreal, and we just started asking around. And one of the first people that we met on the docks said, none of the big companies take passengers anymore because passenger insurance is just too expensive. It's not worth it. But said, sometimes the Russians take passengers, if you just give them cash. And so my father turned to me and said, "You're not sailing with the Russians." So
what did you do?
I sailed with the Russians. They were the only people who were doing it. Nice. So that was a big cargo. That was a big container vessel called the Khudozhnik Romaz. And they spoke no English. So the captain's wife and 2 children were on board. And his son probably spoke the best English. His older son probably spoke the best English of anyone on that ship. So I relied to a large extent on his son, and I had a little Berlitz phrase book. So I was concerned that there was going to be a repeat of that situation, but it was going to be on a smaller vessel with only 3 crew members, and we were going to be at sea for 2 weeks rather than 1 week. So I was worried that this was going to be more difficult from a social point of view.
Did you download the Google Translate Russian offline?
Yeah. So I had Russian. I had a phrase book. But it turns out, so Diman is a yacht captain. So he captains the Tiburon, which is the boat that we sailed on. And a standard job for him is that the owner says, "Look, there's a regatta down in Phuket next month in Thailand. Bring the Tiburon down to Phuket, and I'll fly in for the regatta that weekend."
And what is a regatta for the audience?
A regatta is a boat race. So bunch of boats race from one port, maybe out to some island, and then race back. And officially, that's what it is. Unofficially, it's a chance to get together with other sailors and eat and drink and tell stories.
Have fun.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a bit of racing going on in the background. So a standard job for him is to move the Tiburon, move the sailboat around the East Asian coast. And to do that, you need to speak some level of English because you're dealing with authorities in Singapore or in Hong Kong or in South Korea. And then Alex Maklikov, the electrical engineer, is also crew on another yacht. And so he's not the captain on the other yacht, but he's also worked along that coast as well. His English wasn't quite as good, but was certainly good enough. And he was eager to learn more English. So it turned out to have been much less of a problem than I was worried about. And yeah, we became friends, and that was really nice. That was unexpected and nice. They were extremely hospitable.
you've spent 14 days with them, so I would hope you've become friends with them.
Yeah. I mean, my concern was that they could have just seen me as some guy with a lot of money who they were paying to move from Vladivostok to Fukuoka, and that was it. And they were going to deliver me to Fukuoka. They were going to get their payment, and then sayonara. But they took me in. They explained things to me. They translated for me. They made me part of the community. And
nice.
So, did you completely away from the internet?
Well, I had thought we were going to be. I had thought that we were going to be 2 weeks in the middle of the Sea of Japan. But turns out that wasn't the plan. The plan was, I mentioned earlier, the plan was to spend the first week getting as far as we could, so that if a typhoon did come up, we would have options. So what that meant is that when we left Vladivostok, we wanted to get through North Korean water as quickly as possible, because North Korean water is dangerous for a number of reasons. So my captain D-Man in 2016 had been forced into a North Korean port. He was returning on his own private sailboat and was attacked by fishing boats and forced into the port. So the Russian Foreign Ministry had to intervene to get him out. So he got back to Vladivostok and into the marina, and there were journalists, including the BBC World Service. And
what was the point of doing that to him?
I don't know. I don't know what had happened. I mean, I think North Korea is generally a difficult neighbor. And so I don't know whether it was just a number of fishing boats who felt that he'd done something wrong, or whether there was an official authorization. He was released quickly, so it didn't seem to have been a big deal.
Maybe they were suspicious of why he was there.
This is the route that you take if you're leaving Vladivostok on a boat that size. That's really the only direction you're going. You're going south. Okay. Because you get through North Korea, and then South Korea becomes the gateway to the rest of the world at that point. So that was one reason that he was concerned. The second reason is that North Korean fishing boats typically aren't properly maintained. They won't have lights on at night, so you might not notice that you're about to hit one until you're almost on top of it. So we were very fortunate that we had a full moon when we left Vladivostok. So we had night watch, of course. There was always someone on deck looking, and so we had good conditions. But we didn't see any North Korean vessels at all during our whole time passing through North Korean waters.
Nice.
Yeah, that was a surprise and a relief. I mean, from an adventure point of view, I was kind of hoping we would see one, but
you're hoping?
Well, I thought, this was going to be an adventure, right? And so I should get the full adventure. I should see what it's like to almost smash into a North Korean fishing boat and have them attack. But no, I think that's fine that we didn't have that adventure. So it turns out we first reached an island called Uliangdo. And so Uliangdo is a Korean island that's just a bit south of the North-South Korean border, if you were to project that out into the Sea of Japan. And the crew was hoping that we would be able to spend a couple of days in harbor there. There was some problem with our engine overheating a bit. And so they wanted just to we'd been going hard to get to that point. And so they were working 4-hour shifts. Each of them would take a turn 4 hours on the helm, and then they would sleep and do other duties, and then again would be back on 8 hours later. So they were going pretty hard. So we reached Uliangdo. We spent a couple of days at Uliangdo, and then the South Korean Navy or Coast Guard moved us along. And so the next place that we ended up going to there's an island called Koje or Gyeoje, which is just southwest of Busan. And there's a large national park that runs across that island and a number of other islands. So once we'd gotten further south, we pushed ourselves a bit further west towards the Koje or Gyeoje area. And that's when Chanhom, the typhoon, began to develop. So this was, I think in Japan, it's called Typhoon number 14.
Okay.
Yep.
And so now now you have a name Typhoon,
Yeah.
which triggers certain privileges to you in terms of seeking refuge, correct?
Yeah, it could have allowed us to enter Japanese waters. Now, it's not clear to me whether our argument would have been accepted, because Chanhom at this point is to the east of us, and we would have been proposing to travel east into Japanese waters when we were already in a relatively sheltered position in South Korean waters. So it's not clear to me whether that would have been an acceptable argument, first. And then second, I think we felt that we were in a good position in the South Korean waters. We were about a day's sail from Fukuoka at this point, and so the job was just to sit out the typhoon.
How many days had passed by then?
When was that? I think it probably, so we left Vladivostok on the 29th of September, and I think Chanhom may have peaked on the 9th or 10th of October. But you can see it coming. So Kirk's suggestion is that usually, in his experience, usually a typhoon takes about a week out of your sailing, because you want to get off the open water 3 or 4 days in advance, and it's going to take a couple of days after the typhoon for the waters to calm down again. But especially, go ahead.
So basically, it's already been about at least 10 days that have passed since you sailed off, right? Or no?
Well, so we get to Uliangdo, I think, by the first weekend. And then we get down beyond Busan to Koje or Gyeoje fairly quickly after that. And then it's towards the end of that week so we're watching the weather forecasts. And so it's towards the end of the week that we see Chanhom beginning to form. Mm-hmm. And so that's the point at which we know that we're gonna stay here if we can.
So sounds like you didn't get bored.
No. It was actually, there were a lot of ways in which it was wonderful. So one of the surprises, so in general, I understood that people who spend a lot of time at sea have ways of storing videos. So when I was with the Russians in 1994, this was on VHS. But now Alex, the electrical engineer, had a couple of hard drives, and I forget how many petabytes of data he had on these hard drives. So they had all sorts of films. One of the films, though, it was a television series. It was a Russian television series called House Arrest. And it's about this mayor who gets arrested in what's called a sting operation. So a sting operation is when the police suspect that you are the sort of person who will commit a crime. And so they create a situation in which you commit a crime and they record it. And so then you're caught committing the crime on camera. So this House Arrest series has this young, charming, charismatic, talented mayor of a Russian city who's also corrupt. He's taking money for contracts, and he goes into this toilet to hand someone a briefcase with money in it for a contract, and it turns out that's the sting operation. So he gets arrested, and he gets committed to something called house arrest while he's awaiting trial. So when you're under house arrest, you're not sent to a jail. You're sent back to your house, and you're kept under guard. In his case, a bracelet was put on his leg, and the bracelet could tell if he left the house. But the twist was that the house that he was sent to was the house that he still had as his official registered house. And this was the house that he lived in when he was a boy in the last years of the Soviet Union. So this was a communal apartment that 3 or 4 different families lived in. And when he was a boy living in the house, because he was smart and liked reading books, he was bullied by one of the other boys who was kind of bigger and stronger. And when he goes back to the house, that other boy is still living there and has now turned into a big, strong construction worker. So this relationship that he had when he was being bullied as a boy is then renewed as an adult. So that's the background. Now because he's smart and ambitious, he's trying to get released from house arrest. Yeah. So he's phoning all of his contacts. So it's a vicious. It turns out the governor is corrupt as well, and so everyone is corrupt or incompetent, and everyone is scheming. And so I was watching this and thinking, how could they run this on Russian television? So it was it was smart, it was vicious political satire. Go ahead.
Did it have subtitles? How are you following?
No, it didn't have subtitles. If you know corruption, you can fill in some of, two really big guys with shaved heads come by. You know what those really big guys with shaved heads are there to do. So you can understand some of it just by looking, but they were also translating.
Nice.
And the point that they were making is that they were saying this is realistic. They thought that maybe I wouldn't understand because I wasn't Russian, but they were saying this is the reality. So if you go on YouTube, the first episode has been uploaded on YouTube. The comments on it are all in Russian, but if you translate them, you have people making comments like, "This isn't a satire. This is documentary,
reality TV."
Yeah. So there were all sorts of things.
If anyone is interested, what's the name of the show again?
It's called House Arrest. Yeah. So the first episode is available on YouTube. I don't know where the other episodes are.
So what else did you do for fun? How did you eat? What did you eat? How did you cook?
Yeah. So the captain was D-Man, and then the two crew members were both called Alex. So there was Alex the engineer, and then there was Alex the cook. So Alex the cook had worked on big fishing boats for his whole career. So he was a professional ship's cook. So before we left Vladivostok, we did these shopping runs to strange places on the outskirts of Vladivostok that I would have never seen before. So these were the bulk food stores that had good food at low prices. And one of the shopping malls that we went to was a bunch of container units, refrigerated container units that had just been dropped onto the hillside. And so the merchants were operating out of the container unit. At the end of the day, they would shut the steel door, they would lock the steel door, and they would go home. So Alex just took care of the food, and he did a really good job of it. We supplemented. We had a fishing rod that was running out the back of the yacht when we were sailing, and Alex could take a fish off the line and have it on our plates within 20 minutes. Any
sashimi or?
No, it was battered. I guess battering it was the basic preparation.
Okay, so give us your favorite dish that you had on the boat, for example.
I think so. This is going to be difficult for me to admit because I pretend that I'm a vegetarian. But the first battered fish dish was excellent. Yeah.
Did you cook sometimes?
No, Alex took care of all of this. I mean, I made tea and coffee. So I was trying to find a way in which I could be useful on board. Because it's a small community, I wanted to be a helpful member of the community, not just the guy with the American dollars. And so I tried winching, for example. So when you take a sail up or down, or you let the sail in or out, you're pulling on ropes, and you're winding the ropes around something called a capstan. That's called winching. And so the very first day, one of the Alexes wanted to go up to the top of the mast to check some of the instruments at the top of the mast. So I said I could help winch him up. And so I was throwing my whole body into this, trying to winch him up to the top of the mast. And then the other Alex the cook, he's much bigger than I am. And he just pushed me aside. And then with one arm, he was winching much more quickly than I was with my whole body. Wow. So I was trying to find ways to be useful. In the end, the role that I had was what's called Junge. So a lot of Russian sailing terminology comes from German and Dutch. And Junge means boy. So the Junge is the cabin boy. So when you start sailing as a Junge. And so you're collecting the water, the bucket of water afterwards to wash up. You're doing kind of little things like that.
Is that like apprentice maybe?
Yeah, it's an apprentice. So it's
trainee.
So all of the crew on my boat had started as Junges at one point. Now in the Russian case, if you were a Junge before autopilot, one of your jobs was to keep the ship sailing straight while the rest of the crew got drunk. But with autopilot, you don't need a Junge to do that anymore.
And so I'm guessing if they're using German and Dutch terminology, that there's a history there in terms of how modern sailing in Russia was established.
Yeah. So I think that owes to Peter the Great. So I think Peter the Great was a modernizing czar. So his capital is St. Petersburg, and that's intentionally right on the Baltic Sea. So he's looking west. He's looking to Europe with that. He sends people to the Netherlands to learn shipbuilding. Whereas the current capital, Moscow, is more insular, it's more inland. And so it's not facing Europe in the same way. So there's even a Dutch opera called Czar and Zimmerman, which means king and carpenter. And so it's a comedy opera about, so Tsar Peter the Great apparently goes to this Dutch shipping yard, maybe in disguise. And there's a Russian carpenter called Peter, and the two of them get confused. And so like maybe a big banquet is put on for the carpenter, and maybe they're trying to marry the Tsar to some other woman. Yeah. So there, yes, that's where the Dutch comes from.
So now you're a Junge on the ship.
Yes.
And making an effort to be useful.
Yeah.
Which is commendable.
Yes, thank you.
So have you ever done this kind of adventure before? Like
No.
Since you were kids or?
No. I sailed I did a bit of sailing as a Boy Scout on what would be called a dinghy. So the particular type that I used was something called the laser. And that was a standard. And I think lasers are still around. So those are just small sailboats that take one or two people. So I'd done some of that, but that was years and years ago. I guess even in 2006, I had an Austrian friend who'd rented a sailboat off the Dalmatian coast. So that's the coast off of Croatia. So I think his father was maybe turning 70 or maybe 65. And so he and his brother had rented a sailboat as a birthday present. And they needed a fourth person. So I was invited to join them. But they were speaking German. My German at that point was very poor. And so I ended up just sunbathing on that trip. And and that was only 3 or 4 days as well.
Wow.
Okay. So after Korea, you seek shelter in Korea from the typhoon.
Yeah.
And then at some point you decide it's been 14 days or almost 14 days and it's time to head to Fukuoka.
Yeah, that's right. So we need to give Kirk 24 hours notice because he needs to notify the Japanese Navy that a foreign vessel is entering Japanese waters. So we do that. We have a satellite phone. So you'd asked earlier, Tamago, about whether we were completely offline. So it turns out, Korea has very extensive internet connectivity. And so when we were close to Uljengdo, and then also when we were close to Gyeonggi, we were often able to surf on public Wi-Fi. And so part of the morning activity would involve standing on the bow of the boat, holding our mobile phones towards the shore to try and get Wi-Fi. Yeah. The Korean buses also seem to have Wi-Fi hotspots in them, so we could track these Wi-Fi hotspots coming in and out of range as the buses traveled along the coastal highway. But when we left the coastline, the GSM signal worked a bit longer. But when we left beyond that as well, we needed to use the sat phone. And so the sat phone looks like a 1990s Nokia. It's this big plastic thing. It's got the 12 buttons. It's got the little LED screen. And then speaking on it, so when I phoned Kirk and I got through to Kirk, I said moshi moshi, and I heard back a moshi moshi. And I wasn't sure if that was Kirk saying moshi moshi to me or whether that was an echo of my voice.
Were you using a Thuraya phone?
It was an Iridium.
Okay.
Yeah. So apparently, I guess earlier in the week, I think Alex, the engineer, had been speaking to his wife, and he was shouting at her, and so I made some comment about this to Dima, and maybe Alex was maybe saying who it was. He's saying it's Alex, your husband, and so I said to Dima, should I be worried that his wife doesn't recognize him? And Dima said, no, it's just the phone. He says that when he speaks to his wife thinks that he's been drinking. And so he says, like, you sound like you've been drinking. So
very poor connectivity, basically.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So you called Kirk-san.
Yeah, called Kirk and told him when we were coming in. He said that we needed to enter the marina at 10 o'clock Shinkansen time. Not before 10 o'clock, not after 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock Shinkansen time. And he would have immigration and quarantine and everyone else there to see us.
How do you do that on a boat to be so precise with your timing?
So the way we did it is we got into Fukuoka harbor at maybe 4 a.m, and then we just anchored. And we anchored probably, so the unit of measurement that you use at sea is the mile. It's the nautical mile. And so we probably anchored about a mile and a half away from the marina. And we ended up entering at 10:03. And partly one of the other problems that we'd had as sort of a running problem is that the anchor chain wasn't working properly. So the electronics controlling it weren't working. It would also get stuck on the seabed. So when we moved to pull up the anchor chain, it took us a couple of minutes extra to do that. But yeah, then we made it at 10:03.
10:03, and they were not mad at you, or
no. No, the berth that we were supposed to go into had changed, but everyone was in good mood. It was a sunny day.
So Kirk meets you, pays off the 40% remaining in cash to the crew.
Yeah.
In US dollars or Japanese yen?
US dollars.
US dollars.
Yeah.
And then he guides you to immigration, port authorities. Walk us through it.
So he's got a bottle of Canadian Club and a bottle of sake as well. So this is, and so then he takes a shopping list. So the crew are not going to be allowed off of the vessel. But what he can arrange is new water will be, the tanks will be filled with water. So we were running low on two things. Because this was the longest trip that either of Alex, the cook, had been at sea longer on the big fishing vessels. But in terms of a small yacht like this was the longest length of time they'd been at sea. Not because we were going far, but because we had this 14-day requirement. So we'd gotten very low on water, and we had run out of alcohol, and that was the kind of the bigger concern, I think. So they made this they made this shopping list for Kirk. So Kirk was going to refill the tanks, we were going to refuel, and then Kirk would do a shopping run. And at this point, they only had $100 bills because Kirk had just paid them all of these US $100 bills. So we had to specify the shopping list so that the total would round to a multiple of $100. And one of the elements on the shopping list was 2 liters of whiskey. And so Kirk wanted to know what type of whiskey. And I said, no, it doesn't matter what type of whiskey. It's just 2 liters that matters. So I think he probably got one of those big plastic Suntory bottles of whiskey that you can find in the konbini.
So not the Hibiki.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. So how did Japanese immigration react, or when they see you, or because I thought a stamp.
Yes, that's right. So they had been told in advance. So that was okay. Like I did not buy my ticket to Russia. I didn't get my visa until Kirk told me that he'd spoken to everyone in Fukuoka, and everyone said that it was go. So they were expecting us. So Kirk drove me from the marina to the ferry terminal because immigration's in the ferry terminal. So first I had to sign a number of documents at the marina itself, and then Kirk drove me to the ferry terminal. And when we got to the ferry terminal, he had to phone a number, and someone had to come down to meet us because the terminal was generally closed and the immigration hall was closed. And then I was led up into the main immigration hall, but through side doors, through the doors the staff would go through. So I walked through the locker room, for example, and then I entered the immigration hall, and the people that had taken me through then went into the booth in front of me. And then I walked up to them and I gave them my passports. And so one of them looked at the passport and saw that I had stamped out of Russia on the 29th of September, and it was now, I think, the 14th of October. Oh. So he understood immediately that I had spent 14 days at sea. And so he looked at me and he said, "Big adventure." And that was
he
nice.
Said?
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. So that was reassuring, because at this point I didn't know, this is where this is where we were going to see if this was going to work or not. And then the other official disappeared with my passport and then came back and asked me questions that are not the sort of questions that I'm asked when I usually show up on a regular tourist visa.
Okay, so you obviously were let through.
Yeah. Kirk, and then I go out to see Kirk, and he told me he was beginning to wonder because it was taking longer.
Well, so through this big adventure, has there been any changes in your way of thinking or seeing things?
Yeah, I guess the real delight for me was I guess a delight that happens normally during travel, which is where you discover the world is a much more amazing place than you think. So I had no idea about political satire in Russia. Modern political satire in Russia. It was a delight to be taken in and befriended and looked after by 3 Russian strangers, especially given that these days all of the Russian news stories are stories about US elections and political dissidents and etc. So there's a very negative, narrow, which I'm sure is completely accurate in that narrow frame, but gives one a very limited perspective on the country as a whole. So I've mentioned Big Alex the cook. His English was very limited, but he found ways of just taking care of me that didn't use language. So when he could see that I was tired, he would make a pillow sign with his hands and would point me towards bed. He would put food in my mouth that he'd just made, and
wow.
So this
Cute.
is this. Yeah. So here's a guy who doesn't look cute. He looks like the standard Russian bear. He's the sort of guy who looks like he's always a bit drunk, maybe, and he's overweight, and you wouldn't want to get into a fight with him. And he was putting food in my mouth, and so it was
a bear
really
with
sweet.
a heart of gold, basically.
Just a decent person looking out for a guy he was traveling with, and. Yeah, and then just pure fun as well. So at one point off the South Korean coast, it's nice and sunny. So I'm sitting out in my underpants in the sun off the South Korean coast. We've decided to turn the stereo system on, and so we're listening to this London punk band called The Clash in the sun on a New Zealand-built Russian yacht, and I'm reading Albert Camus' La Peste, which is about a bubonic plague epidemic. And I thought this is just as cool as it gets.
For some people, anyway.
For me. For me.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
So my question to you would be, any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to share with people listening to the story that we haven't covered?
Yeah. So I asked on the last day, I asked D-Man the captain, it was a bad question that I asked him. I said, are you Asian or European? Okay, so that's a terrible question. But he gave a good answer. He said, we're Asian Europeans. And he said that a lot of Japanese and Koreans come up to Vladivostok because they want to see a European city. So if you want to see a European city and you want to stay almost in your time zone, get up to Vladivostok. If you want to go sailing, consider Vladivostok as well. The 7 Feet Yacht Club, which is the club there, is an extremely good community. They're supportive of each other, they're professional sailors, and they'll look out for you as well. One of the women who's involved in the administration of the yacht club is an Olympic sailing judge. When you meet them, they tell you stories about how good the other people are. So no one's talking about how good they are. They're talking about what a hero the other people are. And so it was just a great community of people. So if you want to see a European city, Vladivostok. If you want to sail, again, I'd recommend Vladivostok in the summer.
So fly into Vladivostok in the summer, go to the port, look up the 7 Foot Yacht Club.
Get in touch with them. They've got a great website, 7 Feet Yacht Club. It's a great website. It's all in English. You can get in touch with them. Mention my name.
Will do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Colin Rowat.
Yeah. The spy. They thought I was a spy at first.
Well, thank you so much, Colin-san. It was a pleasure speaking to you and listening to your story, and I'm sure a lot of our audience will enjoy it as well.
ありがとうございました、太郎さんと孫さん。
Thank you.
またね。
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Glocal. with your host, Tamago.
and Kangaku Taro. See you next time.
Bye bye.
Special thanks for Mr. Natsuki Ueda for sound editing.